Okay, so I'm going to try to do this without totally stepping on any live grenades. I've probably shot this version of this episode or whatever you want to call it. I don't even know how many times now. Just because, again, the point of this channel and this show and this podcast is really just about history. I want to talk about history and specifically the history of warfare within different time periods and different regions throughout the world. My goal is to not really talk about modern military operations that are going on today. However, a huge part of the reason why I studied Robert Rogers to begin with was to better understand my role and what I was doing in special operations and in my career. And one of the things that was so illuminating to me was the fact that when I was training to become a Green Beret, during the Q course, there was a period of time where we talked about the history of special forces and where it started and sort of how we arrived to where we are today. And there was a whole host of things we talked about, but one of the things we talked about was indeed Robert Rogers and the Rangers. And obviously it's known, or it's well known, that there's no direct correlation between the Rangers that fought in the French and Indian War and modern Special Forces Green Berets today. But they do try to connect the two just in terms of like an ideological mission set, if you will. You know, Robert Rogers was doing X, Y, and Z, and today in Special Forces as Green Berets, we are doing X, Y, and Z, much like Robert Rogers was doing. And the conclusion was Robert Rogers was conducting some form of asymmetrical warfare, and that's what Green Berets today do. And at the time, I just accepted it. It just, sure. I know nothing about Robert Rogers. In fact, at the time, I don't think I'd ever heard of Robert Rogers. But what was really interesting was, and I didn't know this till years later, is the fact that I had signed up to become a Green Beret. And what was really embarrassing was, like, I actually had no fucking idea what Green Berets did. All I know was they did special operations, which my, pea brain at the time, in my early 20s, was, hostage rescue stuff and roping out of helicopters at night and using night vision and doing, if you had asked me to describe what Special Forces did, I might be able to tell you the laundry list of mission sets that they do, but that's because I had to memorize them. But if you actually asked me in detail what that meant and what the implications were, I couldn't really tell you. And I guess in fairness to me, I don't think many guys, at least in my day and age, which wasn't that long ago, couldn't describe what Special Forces did. And it's less embarrassing to me now because there is this belief that Special Forces does something that they actually don't do. And what I'm really trying to get at is, if you talk to a ODA or a Green Beret and say, hey, just describe to me what the mission set is, they're going to rattle off a bunch of things. Hey, we do coin counterinsurgency operations. We do direct action missions. We do foreign internal defense, special reconnaissance missions. And of course, our bread and butter is UW, or unconventional warfare. But the reality of the situation is at least today, and this hasn't always been the case, I guess you could argue, but I think there's a serious lack of understanding of what unconventional warfare is, what it looks like. And also, again, the fact that Green Berets don't do unconventional warfare. So to just give you a really quick once over, this is super generalized. It's not in depth. This is just like a gloss over of what UW is. UW is when you deploy an individual or a small group or small team of commandos, for lack of a better word, and you send them out and they meet up with an insurgent force, typically, not always, and they organize them and they train them and they work. And these are sort of the buzzwords: by, with, and through those individuals to execute some sort of military operations that is interlocked or interconnected with the national security interests of the state actor. So you deploy them covertly. They sneak into the country in whatever shape, way, or form that looks like. They meet up with this resistance force. A good example of this is like the OSS in World War II meeting up with the French resistance to conduct special operations missions, sabotage missions, espionage against the Nazi regime at that time. And again, sometimes it's sort of you're laying down the groundwork for what would eventually become a full-scale conventional invasion of conventional military forces, which is certainly what was going on in Europe during World War II. And sometimes it's simply like some random country in the middle of nowhere, and we just don't like what the government is doing, so we need to get rid of them. And we're going to do that not with an American face, but with a local uprising face. We're just going to sort of hold their hand. That is the idea of UW or asymmetrical warfare, some version of asymmetrical warfare. Now, to go back just a tad, the belief that Robert Rogers and his Rangers were doing any form of UW is a radical misunderstanding. You could certainly argue they were doing a form of asymmetrical warfare, particularly in their time. Now, the strategies and the tactics they were using are today just sort of standard infantry, Ranger battalion type tactics or strategies, whatever. But again, back in the 18th century, the middle of the 18th century, the strategies that Robert Rogers and his Rangers were using were certainly radical and not common, and therefore they were unconventional, if you will. Or in a few episodes ago, I called it asymmetrical warfare versus symmetrical warfare. Green Berets, and the reason why they teach guys that are going through the Q course today that they are linked with Robert Rogers is because Robert Rogers worked by, with, and through Native partners to conduct the sort of covert action style missions. This is a huge misunderstanding of what Robert Rogers was doing. And like I said, also it has implications as far as like what modern military officials believe Green Berets to be doing today. Robert Rogers indeed worked with Native American allies. However, it wasn't by, with, and through them. They augmented his forces. So back in the mid 18th century, the English forces, a lot of the terrain was unknown. And so they relied heavily on Native partners to sort of guide them and show them how to get to certain places, or they may have just a knowledge of the terrain or the area better than Robert and his Rangers. And so they would use them in that capacity, and they did use them as soldiers as well. But if, more often than not, if Robert Rogers is going out on an operation, if he had 100 English colonial type, Scots, immigrants, Ulster Irish, Welsh, English, whatever, the bulk of his force was made up of those colonial frontiersmen, those bushmen, and maybe a small fraction was made up of the Native American partners. And very often Native partners would just sort of like abandon their mission and their operation and their alliances with the English to go do other things. And they would kind of go back and forth and back and forth. So they weren't always present. So again, our understanding just as a unit, as a modern military unit of our historicity is not really accurate. Robert Rogers and his Rangers were simply just kind of doing what modern Ranger Battalion guys do today. And I highlight this because, again, these two things cannot be true at once. Robert Rogers cannot be, the OG daddy of Green Berets and also the OG daddy of Ranger Battalion, because Ranger Battalion is a very elite, that's the word I would use. They're an elite light infantry force that are given special missions very often. And they also augment other special mission units and in JSOC. So what do Green Berets do? Simply put, Green Berets are soldier diplomats. If it doesn't sound very sexy, it's because it frankly isn't very sexy. And the reason I say it's not very sexy is because armies for all of human existence, particularly in the modern era, for the last few hundred years, we have sent conventional forces to go work with partner or allied forces for any number of reasons, whether that's we're training with them, we are assisting them so they can prepare better for a war that they're about to face. And as a country, as a government, we have interest in their success. But UW and the sort of diplomatic soldier role, they're very, very different things. If you're going to go do unconventional warfare, asymmetrical warfare, number one, it has to be covert. It has to be of absolute clandestine secrecy. Number one. Number two, you're actually not only you're working by, with, and through the Native partners. But again, although Green Berets suggest that they work by, with, and through Native partners, they don't actually do that. I mean, we deploy Green Berets all over the world, and they certainly assist allied partners. They may train them. They may provide some equipment from time to time and a certain level of expertise. But the likelihood that you as an ODA are going to deploy to South America or Africa or any one of these, Southeast Asia, any one of these areas where there are conflicts that are ongoing, the notion or the idea that you're going to go there and you're going to have the opportunity and you're going to get the green light to go do combat operations with these guys is more than likely never going to fucking happen. And this is the misrepresentation of special forces to the guys that want to join the unit. And it causes a ton of fucking heartburn. I mean, a lot of the guys in interviews that went on to join JSOC that came from special forces, or maybe they went from like Ranger Battalion, they became a Green Beret. One of the reasons they cite as to why they left the unit, special forces unit, and go on to join a special missions unit is specifically because they got there and they realized, like, wait a second, like, you told me I was going to do asymmetrical warfare and unconventional warfare, but all I'm doing is going to like fucking Poland or the Balkan states to meet up with some guys who claim to be special operations dudes. They're not even in a conflict. They're not doing operations. And I'm teaching these guys very, very basic infantry tactics. Case in point, I deployed to Bulgaria with my ODA some years ago, and we were part of a larger training exercise with conventional forces to do this whole training exercise. It was a whole thing. We had like the Romanians were there, the Greeks were there. I can't even remember all the different nations that had coalesced. And we were working with the Bulgarian special operations guys. And what we quickly realized was we had this plan to do all kinds of high speed stuff with them that really fell into that vein of like special operations. But almost within 24 hours, we realized like these guys didn't even know really how to patrol. They didn't understand small unit tactics. They didn't, although they had a medic that actually, kudos to him, who's fully capable, his skill set as a medic, and actually the other dudes within that unit that were there, they didn't have the level of expertise of combat medicine that they needed. So we honestly spent the plurality of our time just training these guys on, again, just like your basic entry level soldiering skills. But to say that you had to be a Green Beret to go do that type of mission, even if it was a training mission, is just nonsense. A mature, experienced, conventional officer with a group of senior enlisted guys could have done exactly what we did. And this is happening. Like, there are conventional forces that are going out there doing what we would consider to be the sort of run-of-the-mill special forces mission, and they're doing just fine. Sort of case in point, in this happened in Afghanistan. Very close friend of mine is a field artillery officer, or was at the time, and he deployed on a combat rotation to Afghanistan. And when he arrived, or right before he left, he was basically tasked to go hand select the most skilled and experienced NCOs. They made a small sort of cohesive team, and they were sent out to basically conduct some form of a special forces / infantry type mission where they worked with Afghan partners, Afghan army guys, and they were doing the exact same thing I was doing fundamentally when I was deployed in Afghanistan. So, Robert Rogers, again, he certainly, if you do an analysis of the missions he was doing, the tempo of his mission set, how often he was going out, and again, what he was doing, and there was a whole array, and you can go back in previous episodes and I go into detail about a lot of this, but he was doing everything from presence patrols to snatch and grabs to hostage rescue type missions, raids. All of that certainly falls into the special missions unit branch, but it doesn't fall into the special forces sort of arena. And again, it's a misrepresentation and a misunderstanding of what special forces do today. My biggest fear is that by misrepresenting what special forces does as a unit, right? So that sort of the marketing, like you're going out and you're telling guys in the army, in infantry units, typically, hey, this is why you should go join special forces. We're more autonomous. We're a more mature unit. And also, good news, we get to go do the best missions, the coolest missions, the most difficult missions that require special training and special skills. And that we the term we use is we go out and we get to do unconventional warfare. And if you want to go Google, you will see like, what do special forces special forces Green Berets do? It's going to tell you immediately that they conduct UW. That is their bread and butter. Unfortunately, that just isn't the case. And it fucking kills me. And the worst part is we are deploying special forces teams to very hazardous areas And because they are so hamstrung, because their command structure does not want them or will not allow them. By the way, they won't allow them to do these missions, and there's a variety of reasons why. I'm not really going to get into it. It doesn't really matter, other than they will not allow Green Berets, typically, not always, but usually, to go out and do what we would consider asymmetrical warfare type operations. And what ends up happening is you get a group of guys who are type A personality, who are in a conflict zone, who signed up to be there and signed up to go do these risky style operations. And they don't have the support structure to enhance their capabilities so they can go out and effectively do that asymmetrical warfare type mission. Now, the next sort of obvious question is the United States doing, or have we done in recent history and today, asymmetrical warfare UW type operations? Without a doubt, yes. What's happened is, over the course of the last 40 years, other units have sprang up throughout the military and also in sort of the intelligence services apparatus, if you will, that were created and are now leveraged to actually go out and do the prototypical special forces mission. And the reality is there's only so many opportunities to go out and deploy and do these types of operations. And at the end of the day, if the US government gets its pick of the litter, you've got JSOC, you've got the intelligence services, and then somewhere in there, you've got Special Forces Green Berets. They're going to go in and they're going to pluck out the guys at the top of the shelf, and then they're never going to get to Special Forces. They're not going to deploy Green Berets to go do UW. And so at the end of the day, what you really have, unfortunately, tragically, in my opinion, is a unit that has no identity. They don't really know why they exist, other than to go do JSETs in countries, which is something that they may or may not have understood that was part of the deal when they joined Special Forces. I would say overall, though, the vast plurality of these guys had no idea that all they would ever do from the time they joined SF to the time they retired was just go on JSETs and go train allied forces on how to use iron sights or how to use a tourniquet. And by the way, we've been doing it for so long that most of our partners throughout these regions and throughout these areas, they've worked so much and so often with ODAs that when your ODA goes out to do these missions, this deployment, they have really nothing new to bring to it because we've been doing it over and over repeatedly again and again and again. And so very often you get an ODA that will deploy to South America and find themselves bored out of their fucking minds. And what happens when you get a group of type A personalities that like to have a good time and they're, like I said, they're bored, they're going to go out and they're going to go find trouble. And so they go and they get into trouble. And then that makes the unit look bad. And that just compounds the problem more because all of the governing bodies that get to make decisions look at Special Forces Green Berets and they say, hey, every time we deploy these guys somewhere, they're getting into trouble. They're getting into drinking incidents. They're pissing people off locally. We can't deploy these guys anymore. But again, I would say that is a symptom of the belief that these guys were going to go have the opportunity to conduct very difficult special operations missions. And they found themselves doing, frankly, things that any conventional force could do. So in conclusion, I suppose, this is not a referendum on Special Forces Green Berets. Obviously, I was one of them. I'm proud of that. I'm proud of the work that I did in Afghanistan and in other locations. I know that Green Berets are capable of so much more than they are being offered right now. And unfortunately, like I said, in the last 40 or 50 years, there's just so many different types of special operations units that have popped up. And simultaneously, there are fewer and fewer real world opportunities to deploy special operations forces to go can do their jobs, basically. Sort of last anecdotal example, if you will, I was in northern Iraq doing some stuff, and there were a group of partner force guys that were like a SWAT team, but it was like a law enforcement. They also had military application or whatever. And we were deploying actively special operations units to go train with them and sort of, again, run their day-to-day training to make them better soldiers, if you will. It was a very SF mission. And I remember we went to go visit them and hang out with them and sort of, I can't remember, we were doing something with them. And lo and behold, the American unit that was there to conduct this training mission, they were not Green Berets, they were MARSOC guys. And they'd apparently, the last unit that was there were indeed Green Berets, but instead of for some reason redeploying them back to the States and then replacing them with another ODA, they just replaced them with a MARSOC team, which again suggests that this sort of working with allied partners can be done with any variety of special operations units. And moreover, that the Q course no longer really serves a role in terms of just the training, like preparing guys. Hey, you're going to go through this pipeline and we're going to deploy you, and you're the only unit that can go out there and do this type of operation where you are working shoulder to shoulder with our partnered forces, and you're going to train them and you're going to oversee their operations. That doesn't happen really in the Q course at all. And the suggestion that only special forces Green Berets can do that style mission is clearly untrue, given what's going on in the world and what has been going on during Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't know what the future is for Green Berets. I mean, they've sort of been benched, for lack of a better word. And short of another huge conflict where there are just a multiplicity of operations that we need to go execute, where like every unit is tapped. So you're going through that bracket that I was telling you, like JSOC guys are tapped because they're going out and doing their thing. Ranger battalions going out and they're covering down on missions that traditionally JSOC would do, but they got to go do them because there's not enough guys. And then finally, eventually you'll get down to like, hey, we need to go do these operations. Who's left on the bench? Oh, we got Green Berets. Go send the Green Berets to go do that kind of stuff. One more thing, as someone who is a student of history, obviously, if you're on this channel, you know that I've had the privilege to go through and study unconventional warfare operations, 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, 10 years ago. And to simply state this, because I could have a very long form conversation about this, UW is very, very, very complicated. Asymmetrical warfare is one of the most difficult things to understand. And it changes depending on where you are and what your capabilities are and what sort of technologies and skill sets you can bring to bear. The notion that you're going to deploy an ODA for 3 to 6 months to go conduct a UW style operation in a country or a region or an area that they fundamentally don't understand. And it's not their fault. I'm not blaming Green Berets at all for this. It is a failure of the rank structure and the military as an organization to not provide the courses or the classes or the knowledge or whatever you want to call it to the ODAs. I mean, I was deploying to Afghanistan, for example, in Kandahar, and it was a whole Pashtun tribal area. And I wasn't even given any sort of information about just the nuance of how those people existed in the world, what their history was, what their belief systems were. I mean, I didn't even understand. To this day, I love to study Islam and the history of Islam and their belief systems and sort of the different sects within Islam. And I was 22 years old. I could not fucking tell you the first thing about Islam, let alone Pashtun tribes or Bedouin tribes. And I was supposed to go conduct village stability operations where we were meeting up with local elders and start this sort of grassroots movement against the Taliban. I mean, it's just patently absurd. And what we ended up doing that whole time, it was I would argue it was good work, but we were doing kinetic stuff. I mean, we were going out trying to find IEDs to create white space. We were looking for gunfights, and we would use the excuse of we're going to go meet with this local elder and we're going to do a shura and like talk to them and have this like special forces meeting or whatever and build rapport. But we would just say those things so we could go out into an area where we believed we would get in contact with the Taliban. And so and then again, after 6 months, they pulled us out. There's no way you can build rapport with a local Bedouin tribe that are living in mud huts in 6 months. It takes years. And that's why when you look at really successful UW operations, whether it's 100 years ago or 10 years ago, very often the nation state would deploy an individual or a group of commandos to a place, and they'd basically say, hey, you're going to this area. We don't know when you're coming home, but this is what we need you to do. We need you to work with the locals and fight this insurgency against the Turks, against Nazis, whomever, and you'll come home when the mission is done. And that may take years, by the way. And when we use the phrase going native, like very often you would see these guys go native. And Green Berets like to pretend that they go native, but more often than not, they don't. It just doesn't happen. And it's unfortunate. And I think there's a lot of room for growth and there's a lot of opportunity there. But until the need is required, until the need is there, and until the individuals in charge, the leaders, whether that's military or civilian, allow guys to go out and do that and say, hey, we know this is risky, but we got to get it done, and you guys got to do it. We're never going to adapt in the way we need to adapt in order to overcome these huge obstacles that exist within the UW framework. So again, this was an addendum episode. I'm sure you guys are going to have all kinds of fucking opinions and how I'm wrong and blah, blah, blah. If it was a bit unorganized, I apologize. Kind of an ad hoc episode. But I felt like I needed to talk about this. It was something that's important to me. And like I said, a huge part of the reason why I wanted to talk about Robert Rogers to begin with, sort of help me illuminate what's going on today and the sort of current state of affairs in Special Forces. Thanks for joining me. I'm Zach Masick. This is the Dead Warrior Society. We'll see you next time. Deuces.